5 April. I'd always thought I'd weep when I first saw Genoa, but the circumstances in which I arrived there were very different from what I'd imagined. I was really born in this city long before I actually came into the world, and the fact that I'd never seen it only made it dearer to me, as if I'd deserted it and must love it better in order to be forgiven. No one else belongs to Genoa as the Genoese from the east do. No one else can love it as they can. Even if it has fallen, for them it still stands. Even if it has grown ugly, for them it's still beautiful. Even though it be ruined and mocked, they still see it as prosperous and proud. Nothing remains of its empire but Corsica. Corsica and the small coastal republic where every neighborhood turns its back on the rest, where every family calls down a plague on the others, and where the whole population curses the Catholic king while besieging the anterooms of his representatives in search of favor or influence. Yet in the sky above the Genoese in exile, such names as Caffa, Tana, and Yalta still shine, together with Mavocastro, Famagusta, Tenedos, Phocia, Pera, and Galata, Samothrace and Cassandria, Lesbos, Lemnos, Samos, Icaria, Chios, and Giblet. Like so many stars and galaxies and Milky Ways, my father always told me our mother country wasn't the Genoa of today, but the Genoa of all time. But he quickly added that in the name of the Genoa of all time, I must cherish the Genoa of today, no matter how far it had declined. I must even love it in proportion to its distress, like a mother grown old and infirm. Above all, he told me not to resent it if when I visited our home city it didn't recognize me. I was still very young then and didn't really understand what he'd meant. How could Genoa either recognize or not recognize me? Yet when at dawn on our last day at sea, I saw the city in the distance amid its hills, its lofty steeples, pointed roofs, narrow windows, and most of all its crenellated towers, square or round, one of which I knew still bore our family name, I couldn't help thinking that Genoa was looking back at me. And I did wonder whether it was going to recognize me. Captain Domenico hadn't recognized me. When I told him my name, he showed no reaction. Obviously, he'd never heard of the Embriachi, or of the part they played in the Crusades, or of their signori in Giblet. If he trusted me enough to tell me about his smuggling exploits, it's because I am from Genoa and got myself deported from Chios, where he thinks I'll be careful never to set foot again. But it was different with his Genoese partner, Master Gregorio Mangiavacca, who'd come to take delivery of the cargo. He was a huge red-bearded man dressed in yellow, green, and feathers like a parrot, and I'll never forget his reaction when he heard my name. My hands shake and my eyes fill with tears even now when I think of it. We hadn't yet gone ashore, and Mangiavacca had come aboard with a couple of customs men. I just introduced myself as Balthasar Embriaco from Giblet, and was about to explain how I came to be on the ship when he interrupted me, grabbing me by the shoulders and shaking me as if trying to pick a quarrel. Balthasar Embriaco, son of whom? Son of Tommaso Embriaco. Tommaso Embriaco, son of whom? Son of Bartolomeo, I said quietly, trying not to laugh. Son of Bartolomeo Embriaco, son of Ugo, son of Bartolomeo, son of Ancelado, son of Pietro, son of... And he went on reciting from memory my whole genealogy back to the 9th generation. I couldn't have done it myself. How do you come to know all my ancestors? I asked. By way of answer, he just took me by the arm and said, Will you do me the honor of living under my roof? As I had nowhere to go and no money at all, either Genoese or Ottoman, I could only see this invitation as the work of Providence, so I forgot conventional politeness and expressions of reluctance and embarrassment. It was clear I was a welcome guest in Master Gregorio's house. I even had a strange feeling that he'd been on that quay in Genoa for centuries, awaiting my return. He called two of his men and introduced me to them, laying great emphasis on my name. They offered their caps they doffed their caps and bowed low, then asked me to be good enough to point out my luggage so that they could take charge of it. Captain Domenico, who'd been looking on, proud of having such a noble personage for a passenger, but somewhat ashamed that my name hadn't meant anything to him, explained in a low voice that as I'd been forcibly deported by the Turkish Janissaries, I hadn't any luggage. Master Gregorio, interpreting this in his own fashion, felt all the more admiration for the distinguished blood that ran in my veins. He told his men and everyone else within a radius of a couple hundred paces that I was a hero who defied the laws of the infidel sultan and forced the heavy gates of his jails. Heroes like me didn't sail the seas with luggage like ordinary antique dealers. It was touching, and I am rather ashamed of myself for making fun of his enthusiasm. His memory and fidelity personified, and I wouldn't hurt him for the world. He installed me in his house as if it was my own, and as if he owed all he has and all he has achieved to my ancestors. Of course, that's not so. The truth is that the Mangiavacas used to belong to the clan led by my ancestors. They were a client family, allies, and traditionally the most devoted of all our followers. Then, unfortunately, the Embriachi clan, my father and grandfather called it simply the albergo, as if it was one huge shared house, fell on hard times. My forebears, impoverished, scattered among the trading posts abroad, decimated by wars, shipwrecks, and plagues, cut off from their own family and rivaled by newer ones, gradually lost their influence. Their voice was no longer heard, their name no longer revered, and all the client families abandoned them and followed other masters, in particular the Dorias. Almost all the client families, said my host. The Mangiavacas had handed down the memory of the good old days from father to son for generations. Today, Master Gregorio is one of the richest men in Genoa, partly because of the mastic he imports from Chios. He's the only man in Christendom who sells it. He's the owner of the palace I'm in now, near Santa Maddalena church on the heights overlooking the harbor, as well as of another apparently even larger on the banks of the river Varina, where his wife and 3 daughters live. The ships he charters range the 7 seas, the nearest and the most dangerous ones alike, as far as the Malabar coast and the Americas. He doesn't owe any of his fortune to the Embriachi, but he insists on honoring the memory of my ancestors as if they were his benefactors. I wonder whether in this he's not obeying a kind of superstition that makes him think he'd forfeit divine protection if he neglected the past. Be that as it may, the tables have been turned, and now it's he who bestows benefits upon us. I arrive here like the prodigal son, ruined, lost, and desperate, and he welcomed me like a father and killed the fatted calf. I live in his house as if it were my own. I walk in his garden, sit on his shady terrace, drink his wine, give orders to his servants, dip my pens in his ink, and he thinks I'm behaving like a stranger because yesterday he saw me go and smell an early rose without picking it. I had to swear to him that I wouldn't have picked it in my own garden in Gibelet either. But while Gregorio's hospitality has made my distress more bearable, it hasn't made me forget it. Ever since that cursed night in the Janissaries' cell in Chios, not a day has gone by when I haven't had that pain in my chest again, which I felt before in Smyrna. Yet that's the least of my sufferings, and I don't think about it except when it's there. But the pain I suffer over Martha never leaves me day or night. She who came on that journey to get the proof that would set her free is now a prisoner. She put herself under my protection, and I failed to protect her. And my sister Pleasant, who entrusted her 2 sons to me, making me promise to keep them with me all the time, haven't I betrayed her too? Then there's Hatim, my faithful clerk. Haven't I abandoned him too, in a way? It's true I don't worry so much about him. I sometimes think of him as one of those agile fishes that, even after they're caught in the fishermen's nets, find the strength to wriggle out and jump overboard back into the sea. I have confidence in him, and it reassures me to know he's in Chios. If he can't do anything for Martha on the island, he'll go back to Smyrna and wait for me there with my nephews, or else return with them to Gibelet. But what about Martha? In her condition, she can never escape. 6 April. I've spent all today writing, but not in this new notebook. I've written a long letter to my sister Pleasance and a shorter one to my nephews and Maymoon in case they're still in Smyrna. I don't yet know how to get these missives to the people they're addressed to, but merchants and other travelers are always passing through Genoa, and with Gregoria's help I am sure to find a way. I have asked my sister to write as soon as she can to set my mind at rest about what has become of her sons and Hatem. I gave her a brief account of my own misadventures without saying too much about Martha. At least half the letter to Pleasance dealt with Genoa, my arrival here, the welcome I received from my host, and all the nice things he said about our family. My letter to my nephews instructs them to go back to Gibelet as soon as possible, if they haven't done so already. I asked all my correspondents for detailed replies, but shall I still be here when their answers arrive? 7 April. I have been in Genoa for 10 days now, yet until today I hadn't left my host's house and the garden surrounding it. I was exhausted, sometimes obliged to stay in bed, and at best could only drag myself from one chair or bench to another. It was when I made the effort to start writing again that I began to come back to life. Words became words again, roses, roses. Master Mangiavaca, so forceful aboard the ship the day we met, has proved a most tactful and considerate host. Realizing I needed a period of convalescence after all my trials and tribulations, he was careful not to hurry me. But today, sensing that I felt better, he suggested for the first time that I should go with him on his daily business to visit the harbor. He asked his coachman to drive us through the Piazza San Matteo, where the Doria's palace is, then past the tall square tower of the Embriachi, before taking the coast road to the port itself, where a crowd of clerks was waiting. Before leaving me in order to attend to his affairs, my host ordered the coachman to drive me back home via several places of interest, one of which was the Via Balbi, where you can still see how magnificent Genoa must have been in its heyday. Every time we stopped, the coachman would turn and tell me about the memorable building or monument before us. He had the same smile as his master, and talked to me with the same enthusiasm about our past glories. I duly nodded and smiled back. In a way, I envy him. I envy both him and his master for being able to contemplate this whole scene with pride. I myself can feel only longing. How I'd have loved to live when Genoa was the most splendid of cities, and mine the most splendid of its families. I can't get over not having been born till now. Lord, how late it is! How insipid the world seems! I feel as if I had been born in the twilight of time, and able to imagine what the midday sun was like. 8 April. Today I borrowed 300 livres of good money from my host. He didn't want me to make out an IOU, but I wrote out, dated, and signed one in due form. When the repayment date comes round, I know I'll have to argue with him about reimbursing him. That will be in April 1667. The year of the beast will be over, and we'll have had time to see if it kept its terrifying promises. What will have become of our debts by then? Yes, how will it be with our debts when the world, together with all its men and all its wealth, is extinct? Will they just be forgotten, or will they be taken into account in deciding each man's ultimate fate? Will bad debtors be punished? Will those who pay up on time get into heaven more easily? Will bad debtors who keep Lent be treated more kindly than good payers who don't? Just like a merchant to bother his head with such questions, you'll say. Perhaps, perhaps. But I have the right to ask them because it's my own fate that's at stake. Perhaps the fact that I have been an honest merchant all my life will earn me the right to some of heaven's mercy. Or shall I be judged more severely than someone who was always cheating his customers and colleagues but never lusted after another man's wife? May the Almighty forgive me, but I regret my mistakes and my follies, but not my sins. It's not having possessed Marta that torments me, it's having lost her. How far I have strayed from what I was meaning to say. I started talking about death. But one idea led to another, and I found myself talking of Marta and my passionate remorse. Forgetfulness is one grace I shan't be granted, and I don't ask for it, I ask for redress. I think all the time of making things right again. I keep mulling over the wretched episode that got me deported from Rios, trying to think what I should have done to get the better of all those tricks and deceits. Like an admiral after a defeat, I can't stop moving the various ships about in my head to find the strategy that might have brought me victory. I shan't say any more now about my plans except that they are there inside me and keep me alive. Towards the end of the morning, I took the money order to the brothers in the Piazza Banchi. Gregorio had recommended them highly and opened an account. I deposited most of the money I'd borrowed, keeping just 20 or so florins for small necessities and for tips to my host's domestics who served me so willingly. As I walked back to the house, I had a strange feeling that I was starting a new life. I was in another country, surrounded by people I'd never set eyes on till a few days ago, and with new coins jingling in my pocket. But it's a life lived on credit in which I can command anything but own nothing. 9 April. I couldn't understand why Gregorius' family didn't live with him. There was nothing surprising about his owning 2 palaces or even 3 or 4. That's long been quite usual among the wealthiest citizens of Genoa. But I was intrigued by his living apart from his wife. He's just told me the reason. Not without some stammering and stuttering, though he's not shy by nature and isn't one of those people who blush for nothing. His lady, whose name is Orietina, is very pious, he said, and stays away from him every year during Lent, lest he be tempted to forget his duty to remain chaste during the fast. I suspect he forgets it anyway, for he comes back from certain daytime as well as nighttime visits with a telltale sparkle in his eye, nor does he try to deny it. Abstinence doesn't suit me, he says, but it's best not to sin under one's own roof in the house consecrated by matrimony. I can't help admiring this way of coming to terms with the rigors of the faith. I myself pretend to ignore its precepts, but I always hesitate before breaking them in a big way. 10 April. Today I heard some amazing news about Sabbatai and his visit to Constantinople. The stories sound as if they were made up, but I'm quite willing to believe them. My source is a monk from Lerici, who spent the last 2 years in a monastery in Galata. He is a close cousin of my host's, and Gregorio invited him to supper so that I could meet him and hear his account. The most reverend, holy, and learned brother Egidio was how Gregorio introduced him. I've met all kinds of brothers and fathers and such like in my time. Sometimes they've been saints, and often they've been rogues, sometimes fountains of knowledge, and often ignoramuses. So I learned long ago to judge them on the evidence. I therefore listened to this one, observed him, asked him some straight questions, and finally was convinced he was genuine. He doesn't pass on anything he hasn't seen with his own eyes or been told by unimpeachable witnesses. He was in Constantinople last January when the whole population was in a state of excitement, not only the Jews but also the Turks and the various Christians, whether foreigners or Ottoman subjects, all expecting the most extraordinary events. The account Brother Egidio gave us may be summarized as follows. When Sabbatai reached the Sea of Marmara aboard the Kayiki, bringing him from Smyrna, he was arrested by the Turks even before he could go ashore, and those of his followers who'd gathered to greet him were distressed to see him manhandled by two officers like a criminal. But he himself seemed quite unaffected, and called to those who were lamenting to have no fear, for they would soon hear that which they'd never heard before. This restored the confidence of the waivers. They forgot what they were seeing and clung on to what they were hoping, which seemed all the more foolish because the Grand Vizier intended to deal with this grave business himself. He'd been told what was being said among Sabbatai's disciples, that he'd come to Constantinople to have himself proclaimed king, and that the Sultan was going to prostrate himself before him. He'd also been told that the Jews had stopped working, the money changers were treating every day as the Sabbath, and that all this was doing great harm to trade in the empire. No one doubted that in the absence of the Sultan himself, who was in Adrianople, the Grand Vizier was going to take extremely harsh measures. The head of the so-called Messiah would be detached from his body without delay and exposed on a tall column so that no one would ever dare to challenge the Ottoman dynasty again, and business could go on as usual. But what happened in Smyrna, I had witnessed it myself, now happened again in Constantinople. Sabbatai, brought before the most powerful person in the empire after the Sultan himself, was not met with blows or remonstrances or threats of punishment. Make what you can of it, the Grand Vizier greeted him warmly, told the guards to loosen his bonds, offered him a seat, and conversed with him at length on various subjects. Some people swore they saw them laugh together, and heard them address one another as "my honored friend." When the time came for sentence to be pronounced, it was neither death nor flogging, but a punishment so light it seemed almost a tribute. Sabbatai is currently held in a citadel where he's allowed to receive visits from his followers from morning till night, to pray and chant with them, preach sermons and give evidence, and all without any let or hindrance from the guards. More incredible still, said Brother Egidio, the false Messiah sometimes asked the soldiers to take him to the seashore to perform his ritual ablutions, and they obey as if they were under his orders, take him wherever he chooses to go, and wait for him to finish before they bring him back. The Grand Vizier is even supposed to make him an allowance of 50 aspers, handed over to him every day in the prison so that he shan't lack for anything. What more can I say? Isn't this a great wonder, one that defies common sense? Wouldn't any sensible person be skeptical about such a tale? I myself would certainly have railed against human credulity if I hadn't been present at similar happenings in Smyrna last December. This time it's the Grand Vizier who's involved instead of a provincial judge, but that only makes the whole thing more incredible. But the wonder itself is the same, and I can't doubt it. This evening, as I write in my bedroom by the light of a candle, I think of Maimun and wonder how he'd have reacted if he'd heard this story. Would he have ended up agreeing with his father, and like him joining those who call themselves believers and other Jews infidels? No, I don't think so. He sees himself as a man of reason, and for him a wonder cannot take place of a sound argument. If he'd been with us this evening, I imagine he'd have curled his lip and looked away, as I've often seen him do when the conversation made him uncomfortable. I hope with all my being that he's right and I'm wrong. If only all these prodigies could turn out to be false, all these signs misleading, this year a year like any other, and neither the end of the past time nor the beginning of an unknown future. May heaven not confound men of good reason, of good sense, but grant that intelligence triumph over superstition. I sometimes wonder what the Creator thinks of what men say. How I'd love to know whose side he, in his benevolence, would take. That of the people who predict that the world will come to a sudden end, or that of those who think it still has a long road to travel. Is he with those who rely on reason, or those who despise and demean it? Before I shut this notebook for the night, I ought to record under today's date that I've given Brother Egidio my 2 letters. He's soon leaving for the East, and he's promised to deliver them, if not in person, then at least through another churchman. 11 April. Could Gregorio, my host and benefactor, be thinking of marrying me to his daughter? She's the oldest of the 3 girls. Her name's Giominetta, and she's 13. This evening, as we were walking in his garden, he spoke to me about her, saying she was very beautiful and her soul was still even purer than her skin. Then he suddenly added that if I wanted to ask for her hand, I'd do well not to wait too long, as such requests would soon be pouring in. He laughed heartily as he spoke, but I can tell the difference between what's a real laugh and what isn't. I am sure he must have thought it over for a long time, and like any clever dealer, he's already got a plan in mind. I'm not the young handsome match girls dream about, and my fortune is nothing in comparison with his. But I am an embriaco, and I am sure he'd be very happy for his daughter to marry into that name. I suppose that for him it would be the culmination of a lifetime's effort to rise in society. For me, too, such a marriage could only be attractive if it weren't for Marta and the child she's carrying. So, do I forbid myself to marry out of fidelity to a woman from whom life has already parted me, and who is still the wife of another before God and man? Put like that, my attitude is unreasonable, I know, but I also know that this is what my heart tells me, and it would be unreasonable to go against that.